Hi, we'll be starting in a moment. I just wanted to make sure everyone saw Life Without SMPTE. You too can have one of these wonderful t-shirts if you submit an idea of what life would be like without SMPTE, and you can get it over at the SMPTE booth. And also, for those of you from Europe or who would like to go to our conference in Berlin next month, we are offering a special, a 10% discount on registration. But in order to get it, you need to go over to the SMPTE booth. So it's right up and to the left as you walk out of this area on your way out of the hall. So with that, I'd like to get us started and have our program chair, Mr. Hogan, come up. Thank you.
You're looking mighty fine, Pat, there. You know, it's in your new sweatshirt. Good afternoon for our final, or almost our final segment of this afternoon. Our keynote will be moderated and introduced by David Cohen, who's Senior Editor for Features at Variety Daily, I guess. And Daily, David?
Thank you, Bill. So, last year at NAB, I got a demo from Ted Schilowitz, I know a lot of you know Ted, of a virtual reality game, a game where you're being attacked by zombies. And at the end of about 5 minutes of that, having been killed by zombies, I kind of came off stage thinking that was the most amazing, thrilling, terrifying, and different experience I had had in many years, and yet strangely familiar. Does anybody here remember a game called Dactyl Nightmare? Nobody? Not a single person? From the 80s. There's somebody from the 80s, which was a virtual reality game that was kind of similar. And I walked off stage and I went out for a beer with Ted and I said, "Has anybody done this for red carpet coverage?" And he said, "Not that I know of." I said, "Well, I want Variety to be the first." And it took some months to put that together because I kept calling the studios and they were like, "What are you talking about?" They didn't even know what VR was. And then they couldn't see the value in it. But eventually we got a virtual reality package together to cover Guardians of the Galaxy's red carpet on Hollywood Boulevard. And the guys who did that with Variety were Jaunt. And so I've worked with these guys on the beginning of this journey, and it has been remarkable. That is both my disclosure and my qualification to be up here talking to you. So without any further ado about this, let me introduce Arthur Van Hoff, who is the co-founder and CTO of Jaunt VR, who will explain how this works.
Thank you. Welcome, and thanks for inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit about virtual reality in general and a little bit about some of the specific challenges that you will run into when you're trying to produce VR. VR is not a new idea. Actually, since we all sat around the campfire telling stories when we were Neanderthals, you know, VR has been around. And even sort of in Victorian times, they would make VR installations, and this is one that you can go and see in Den Haag in Holland from 1881. It's a 360-degree painting of a beach scene with a beach house in the middle, sort of hiding the sky and creating this sort of VR experience even then. And obviously, even when we started taking pictures, there were stereo pictures. You know, people have been at this for a long time. And also in popular media, VR has been very prevalent. This is a young Christopher Walken in a movie called Brainstorm from 1983. It's a fantastic movie. I highly recommend you see it. It's the last movie with Natalie Wood. And believe it or not, Natalie Wood plays the industrial design engineer for the headset. So, you know, popular media has created an image of VR that is very familiar to a lot of people. But the reality in VR is very different. This is a VR headset, you know, maybe 10 years ago, and it would probably cost about $30,000, mostly used in research. You know, stereo, vision, you know, data gloves, as they call them, and as you can see, there's wires going up to counteract the weight. You know, obviously, this all changed when Oculus came out with the DK1, which is the sort of first consumer-level VR headset that was practical. This is the $300 version of the $30,000 version VR headset. This came out in 2012, which is only a few years ago. You know, not to be outdone, you know, after Facebook bought Oculus for several billion dollars, Google obviously wanted to get into the game, so they built the $3 headset. You laugh, but this is actually a very important development, because Google introduces to the idea of mobile VR, the ability to use your phone as a device to experience VR. And this has opened VR to the masses. You know, there are way, way, way more cardboard VR headsets out there than there are Oculus headsets out there, because they are so cheap. So it has really opened up the ability to do VR, but it is much less interactive because there's no controls. It's sort of limited in some ways. But that has some advantages and some disadvantages. But how come that this simple device works so well? How come that we experience VR in such a vivid way? Well, you got to ask yourself, like, what is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, smell, what you taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by our brain. Obviously, this was said by Morpheus in The Matrix in 1999. And there's a lot of truth to that. You know, reality is an illusion, and we all live in that illusion today. I mean, your vision is not the vision of a camera. Your eye is not good. Your eye is terrible. You see color in a very small area in the front of your, in the center of your vision, and you see there's a big black hole here, and there's one here where your optical nerve goes into the retina. But still, when I look around, not right now actually because of the bright lights, but typically when I look around, I see a very consistent image of a 3D world that has got color everywhere, and you know, there's no big holes in it, and there's no black spots. You know, and that's because your brain is a virtual reality machine, and it doesn't take a lot to fool it into creating a really vivid virtual reality experience, like the one you're having right now. However, you can trick the brain. There's optical illusions are a clever example of that, and you know, often, you know, they're called optical illusions, but they're really brain illusions. You know, it's your brain playing tricks on you, not your optical system. Your optical system is seeing this as it is. It's your brain that is creating confusion. But you know, that's sort of an example of showing that your brain is involved in this, and it's not just your senses. So what made it possible for Oculus to create a device that was only $300 and created such a great experience? Well, this is because of mobile technology. Mobile technology has pushed the limits in various areas very rapidly into a place where it was possible to build a VR headset. You know, there's a couple of components that are really critical. One is the screen. You know, you need a high-resolution screen because you're going to strap it onto your face, and you're going to put magnifying lenses in front of it. So you're going to see every little pixel. So we had to wait to a point where the screen resolution was high enough. And on top of that, we need a screen that has a very high refresh rate. So even sort of TFT LCD displays are really not good enough for VR, because when you move your head, if you run the screen at 60 frames per second, you're going to see stripes, you're going to see lines as you move your head, because the pixels aren't standing still anymore. And as a result, because the refresh rate is low enough, you get a very blurry experience. And actually in the Oculus DK1, that was the case. When you moved your head too quickly, it became very blurry. In the newer devices, they use OLED displays, and they can turn the pixels on and off very, very rapidly so that they don't smear. They're just on when they're in the right position. The other advance that came out of mobile technology is gyroscopes and accelerometers. And these allow you to do very accurate head tracking. And that's what enables you to create an image that apparently looks like it is standing still in space, but it is actually being redrawn in different places as you move your head. there's a sort of a third factor that I like personally is what I call the maker movement. There's a lot of people who are now building stuff again. And, in the years of when the first bubble happened, when the internet bubble happened, you had to build websites. That was the only way to go for startups. But nowadays, you can actually go build hardware. And that's because we have 3D printing, we have cheap manufacturing, and we have all these components just lying around for us to use. The DK1 and the DK2 they actually have a Samsung device in them. The DK2 has an S3, a Samsung S3 inside. So here's a bunch of headsets. And as you can see, the selection is expanding rapidly. This is only, 2 years ago there was one. Like today there's, dozens and dozens. These all have different sort of features. The more recent features that they've added is positional tracking. So the third one from the left here is the Crescent Bay device that Oculus will be coming out with this year. And it has a lot of tracking features for doing positional tracking. And they use an external camera to view the device so that you can interpret lateral motions. In the previous devices, it was mostly rotational motion that you could detect. The device at the bottom here is the Avegant Glyph. And that's an interesting device because instead of an LCD or an OLED display, it uses a MEMS array to project a light into your eyes. And the beauty of that is that there's no pixelation because the pixels actually overlap and merge. Whereas on a sort of digital display, like an OLED screen, you can actually see each red, green, blue pixel right next to each other, which can become a little bit distracting. The white one here in the middle is called the Vove VR. That one is very special because it has eye tracking built in. And the eye tracking is very accurate because it's very, very close to your eye. And you can actually, as you move your eyes inside the headset, they can redraw the display so that it has higher resolution where you're looking than the rest. Also, they can blur out some of the areas you're not looking at to create sort of a depth of field effect, which is very effective. And at the bottom is the HTC Vive, which came out this year. That is probably the best quality device on the market right now. It's not quite on the market yet, but it will be available this year. On the right-hand side, you have all the mobile headsets, and there's tons and tons and tons of them. A lot of them come out of China. They're all sort of cardboard knockoffs, but they basically leverage your mobile device, your mobile phone, to create a VR experience. And the Galaxy Gear VR here on the bottom right is actually an excellent device. It creates a really, really compelling VR experience that is equally on par as the DK2, for example. And over here, you have the new generation ViewMaster, which is actually sort of aimed at a younger audience, but it is a really, really cool device anyway. Now, these two categories of devices have different properties. On the left-hand side, you need a PC. You need a $2,000 high-end gaming PC attached to this device in order to render the game that you want to play. On the right-hand side, you can't do that. You're limited to either very simple games or to sort of media-based experiences like videos. And that's what I like to call cinematic VR. So you have gaming VR on the left and sort of cinematic low interactivity VR on the right. Before I go on, I do want to show you one of my favorite devices, favorite headsets. It was announced at CES this year. This is a device from 2015. Keep that in mind. It's called the 3D Head. The 3D Head, I'm not kidding. I'm sure this is going to be a big seller. But what we're all aiming for is not just VR. We're really aiming for the holodeck experience. And you would think, well, that is a few years away, but we're already working on that. Microsoft has announced the HoloLens. And the HoloLens is a really compelling implementation of an augmented reality experience. And I haven't tried it myself, but I've talked to people that have tried it, and it is very compelling. And the trick with augmented reality is that it is actually significantly harder than virtual reality. Because in virtual reality, you're blocking off the real world, and as long as you do positional tracking correctly, or more or less correctly, you can get away with murder and be sort of less accurate than you would need to be in AR. In AR, if you place an object on my table over here, then if I move my head, if that object is jumping around even a little bit, then it completely destroys the illusion. So in augmented reality, you need extremely accurate head tracking. And apparently, Microsoft has somehow pulled that off. The other problem with AR is that you don't have a lens system to work with. Right? In VR, you can put lenses in front of the screen that you see the screen. Now, some people say, well, then what you do is you just put cameras in front of the screen so you can see the real world. Well, that doesn't work, unfortunately, because if you do that, then you get the lens distortion of the camera projected on the screen, which gets then distorted by the lenses in the headset, then by the lens of your eyes, and by the time it gets to your brain, it doesn't look like the real world anymore. Plus, the cameras are not, they're attached outside your head. So what the HoloLens does is it uses a half-mirrored screen so you can see both the real world and the display. But that means you have a very complex distortion in order to match reality. So it's just a much harder problem, and it's something that will happen, but it will take a little while. And then there is obviously Magic Leap. I don't know if you've heard about this. They've just raised $542 million, mostly from Google, apparently. And they use what they call a planar waveguide projector, which is it's actually related to a medical device. It was an orthoscopic camera that they reversed. So instead of putting a camera on one end and looking down a fiber optic channel, they actually put a light on one end and project an image onto something, onto your eyes, using a fiber optic technology. It is very much overhyped, apparently, because the field of view is very narrow, and there's some videos out there that kind of claim what this company can do, but it's kind of an interesting technology. They call these objects that they insert into the real world totems, which is kind of an interesting term for sort of virtual objects in the real world. John Carmack, he invented Doom. He recently said that almost half the experiences that people have in VR are media experiences rather than gaming experiences. And I think that the reason for that is that gaming is actually not necessarily all that appropriate for VR. When I first started, I thought, well, we'll just take these first-person shooters and they translate directly to VR. It's easy, there's all this content. Gaming is going to drive VR and make it a big success. But it turns out that these games are not designed for VR, and they have way too much motion. And as a result, they cause way too much motion sickness. So Oculus is now telling developers, when you build games, make sure they're stationary. Make sure that they're like on the table and you can walk around the game rather than you're in the game, driving yourself with the joystick. Because if you do that, your visual system and the motion system in your ear is going to cause a lot of nausea. So we actually stayed away, Jaunt, the company, we stayed away from gaming VR and focused on cinematic VR. And cinematic VR is kind of a logical extension of entertainment. And if you look at the movie industry, we went from black and white, from silent movies, black and white silent movies, to talking movies, to color movies. Then we introduced computer graphics. Then we get the big screen. Then we get digital distribution. Then we get 3D movies, and then 3D IMAX. And it's clearly a trend towards more and more and more immersive entertainment. And VR is, in a way, just an extension of that trend. So how is it going to affect the industry? Well, it's clearly going to affect music. I mean, imagine, if you want to go to a Rihanna concert, the first row ticket will cost you $500. Well, what if you could have that same experience for $50 at home? Wouldn't that be something? Or go to a Lakers game. It's $5,000 to sit courtside at the Lakers game, but you can see all the famous people there. You can see how tall the players are. You could easily imagine how compelling that VR experience is there. or film. I mean, just what would it be like if you could be in the film rather than just experiencing it? What if you could see around you and get much more of a immersive sense than you get today? When you go to an IMAX movie like Gravity here, you know, the trailer already says, you know, be part of the movie. Well, this is truly going to be possible with VR. Advertising will be totally different. I mean, you can watch the same ad several times and see different parts of it, or maybe follow different storylines. You know, think about product placement in VR. This is going to really revolutionize how you do advertising. News is a very obvious something for VR. If you're at a demonstration, you know, today, if you watch that on TV, you see the demonstrator. You see an edited 16:9 image that they want you to see. In VR, I can look at the demonstrators, I can look at the police, I can look at the helicopter overhead, I can look at the bystanders. It gives you a very unbiased and objective view of the news. Or travel, you know, I can go to places where I could never afford to go, or places that are hard to reach or that will be gone in the future. Or education, I mean, what is it like to be in the classroom rather than to see it in your browser? That's totally different. In order to create these experiences, we're going to need some technology. So, you know, what do we have to work with? Well, today there's a bunch of consumer cameras available. These are a small selection. These all record 360 by 180 or 180 by 180, depending on the model. The one on the right here is the Panono. It's a throwing camera. You throw it up in the air, and when it reaches the top, it will snap a picture. It's a still image. The bubble camera actually records video, and that's the Ricoh Theta that you can just record like that. All these cameras have one huge drawback, is that they create very nausea-inducing video, because these cameras are very light, and people typically put them on the end of a stick. And they walk around with this camera on a stick, and then when you see it in VR, your head is going, whoa, whoa. It's not a good thing, I tell you. So user-contributed content is going to take a long time before that becomes an acceptable VR experience. However, there are sort of better cameras around. The one on the left over there is the Ladybug camera. It's got 6 cameras we use for Google Street View, for example. It's monoscopic. This is sort of the quintessential GoPro rig. There's a ton of those around. That's a Samsung camera. It can do live. There's this one here on the left is the camera that we use at Jaunt, which records radial imagery in all directions, and then reconstructs stereo from that. Here's a camera that uses 3 stereo pairs. Now, that sounds great, so you get stereo, but the problem is that you get stereo here, you get stereo there, and you get stereo there, but in between, it's really not very good. And the same is true for more elaborate setups that use like RED cameras. I mean, you know, creating 360-degree video is not about image quality. It is much more about, like, can I create a great experience? And, you know, so you don't need the most expensive equipment to create a great experience. What you need is a very consistent, you know, stereoscopic 3D image. And that, you know, for that, I believe you need lots of cameras rather than 6 or 7. So in terms of production, you know, there's obviously a lot of interesting challenges. You need to figure out a way to do storytelling. How do you focus the user's attention? Because the story can be anywhere, right? You can be looking over here when the story is happening over there and miss some part of the narrative. So you need to, you know, guide the viewer through the story. And you can do that in different ways. You can use sound cues, or you can use lighting cues, or you can just use narrative cues, or very simple cues that work very well we found are pointing. If you point, then people immediately automatically look in that direction. Set construction is very challenging. You know, when you're recording, you're recording in 360 degrees, so you need to build a set very differently. The set needs to be a 360-degree set. And what do you do about lighting? Well, you kind of use lights behind the camera because there's no behind the camera anymore. So where do you put the cameraman? Right, so we did a few shoots, for example, where we did a World War II movie, and the way we got around that was we dressed the cameraman up as a soldier. That worked. Sound production is really difficult because you now need to do 3D sound. It's no longer just stereo. It's harder to do in post-production. Oh, and I forget camera motion. How do you move the camera? Can you move the camera? Can you cut between cameras? So cutting between cameras turns out to be very natural. You just sort of teleport to another place. Whereas camera motion is challenging. If you have rocking motion, like if you're walking, that's very nauseating. But dolly-type motion, sort of straight, linear, slow, consistent motion, works very well. Another way to do camera motion is to put it in context. So, for example, inside a car, because then the car gives you a frame of reference and it avoids the nausea effect. How do you do special effects? The tools that exist today are not built for VR. You can kind of use them for VR, but we need much, much better tools, and these tools are being built right now. And how do you do post-production? How do you edit and do color correction? Well, it turns out that you can use the existing tools, but they need to be upgraded. They need to work with 4K stereo or 8K stereo, if possible. And what's the delivery format? That's a very good question. So there really isn't a standard for that today. So what most people use is sort of a Mercator projection called a rectilinear projection. And that's the one at the top there, where the North Pole and the South Pole are really distorted at the top and the bottom. That works. It's not the most efficient way of doing it, but it's sort of fairly easy to understand and mostly standard. But there's lots of other projections, like there's the tiny world projection there in the middle, or a cube map projection, which has its own challenges because you have to fold the cube together and avoid seams. And in the long run, where we're heading, and this is more for augmented reality too, is we're going to go to full volumetric stereo, where you, instead of transmitting a video, which is basically a 2D video wrapped around some shape, is you're actually sending over a texture map and vertices. So you're actually sending over a 3D model of an object. So for example, you have an actor standing on a table, and you can walk around the actor seeing him from all sides. So the things that are important to consider is resolution. Today it is sort of practical to deliver 4K resolution. So if you want to do stereo, you probably end up with 2K per eye. That is sort of a reasonable thing to deliver to a consumer device. But it needs to be at a high frame rate, because if the frame rate is too low, it sort of ruins some of the realism. So at Jaunt, we use 4K at 60 frames per second as the delivery format. And you have to decide what the field of view is. Do you want to send 360 degrees all the way around, or just 180 degrees? If you do just 180 degrees, then there is going to be some, loss of realism when you realize half the world is missing. Do you want to do stereoscopic or monoscopic? So monoscopic is relatively easy. If you go to YouTube 360, you can scroll around to your browser. That's a well-understood problem. Stereoscopic is much harder, because you need to have a consistent stereo image in all directions. And how do you encode that into a spherical image, a spherical projection? That's challenging. One sort of practical problem that you run into is camera synchronization. If you use consumer cameras like GoPros, you need to make sure that they all shoot at the same time. They capture frames at the same time, because otherwise you get motion effects. And on top of that, most cameras are rolling shutter, so you get multiple cameras, especially if you stack them, that take scan lines that are at very different time intervals, which is causing problems. And then once you've shot the content, how do you stitch it together? How do you create a consistent image? And there's a lot of research being done into that as well. And then audio is not standardized. So there's several ways of doing 3D audio. Ambisonics is one, which is a kind of an older technique. It's a sound field recording technique, but also you can also play it back in 3D. That is one of the techniques that we use at Jaunt. to render that, what you do is you actually rotate the sound field to counteract head motion, and then you apply a head-related transfer function to externalize the sound, so it sounds very directional. And then there's Atmos. So Dolby has developed a system for theater sound, which allows you to do object audio, which allows you to place sounds in space around the viewer. And that's called the Dolby Atmos editing suite. And we use that for some of our productions, and then we can render that down into ambisonics for delivery to the consumer. Or we have recently announced a partnership with Dolby to actually render the Atmos on your phone while you're wearing a headset, which actually gives you a really, really compelling experience. We have one short horror movie that got really scary once we switched to Atmos. It was not nearly as scary when it had regular sound. Give you a little bit of background on Jaunt. We incorporated about 2 years ago. We got funded by Redpoint and Highland and Google Ventures. The idea for Jaunt started when one of us went to, I think it was Bryce Canyon, and he sent back an email saying, well, I can send you some photos, but if only we had a gigapixel camera and an Oculus Rift, then you could really be here with me. And that was kind of an interesting observation. And we were back in the office thinking, maybe we should get an Oculus Rift. And we tried it out, and we got a GoPro camera and took some spherical images, and actually found it was a very, very compelling experience to sort of do place shifting using the Oculus Rift. And we decided to start a company. And what we've built is sort of an end-to-end solution. We call it photons to photons, where we can record, encode, and render in the cloud a VR experience very quickly, and then distribute it to a wide variety of devices. We're trying to be completely platform agnostic. So we will work on the Gear VR, it'll work on cardboard, and all the various Oculus devices, and eventually it'll also work on the HTC device. But most importantly, we actually use sort of off-the-shelf production tools for doing post-production. So you can actually render out the video, then import it into Nuke or After Effects or tools like that, and create a master edit, and then reincorporate that as a VR experience. Having done this for a while, we've learned a lot of lessons, of course, because certain things work very well in VR and certain things don't. And we're hoping to work with creatives to create lots of interesting VR experiences. And although we're building our own cameras, we're not a camera company. We're just building cameras because the cameras that we need don't exist. We are hoping to work with the creative community to use our technology to create very excellent VR experiences. So to give you an idea of what we've done so far, this is sort of a sampling of some of the productions we've done. We've recently done an announcement of a partnership with Revolt. We've done monster movies, World War II, some narrative, lots of music content, some concerts. We've done a project with Jack White, and we recently did Other Space with Yahoo, which was very interesting. So what is the future? So I think that in VR the only constant is change. I mean, it's crazy to see how quickly things are changing. There's every week there are new devices and new ideas emerging. And clearly, we're going towards increased quality, realism, and comfort. But the headsets today are really not ready for watching a 3-hour movie. So don't go out and shoot, a 3-hour movie, because nobody will watch it beyond maybe 10 minutes. And the reason for that is partially that, after 10 minutes, the headset is uncomfortable, it gets too hot, or you get thirsty and you're looking for your beer and you have to take it off, right? So that needs to be resolved, and I think that is being resolved. The headsets are getting better, and the quality is improving. I also believe that the content needs to be right for the headset, right? So for for cardboard, for example, these are shared experiences. You try it on, you look around, and then you spend a few minutes in VR enjoying yourself, and then you hand it off to your friends, right? And it's a sort of a shared social experience in that sense. I think there's going to be broad adoption of VR in many different fields. It's a very, very exciting time for VR, and everybody is sort of trying to jump on the bandwagon. And I think there's going to be an explosion of cinematic VR, because today there's a lot of emphasis on the hardware, the devices, the pixels, the frame rate, the accelerometers, all sort of the gearhead stuff. But in the end, it's really all going to be about content. And I think that's where we can play a big role by creating a library of really compelling content. And then beyond VR, I think we're going onwards to augmented reality, because that's clearly sort of the next step. That's really where VR wants to go in the long run. All right. Thank you very much. What's my time? I have no idea.
We're going to move down here to the chairs, I think. Let me bring to the stage Scott Brook. Scott is the VP of Content for Jaunt VR. And we're going to move down here.
Did I take too much time?
No, I've got to tell everybody we're going to blow the clock. We're going to take 15 minutes for this, so bear with us here. So let me bring Scott into this first. We've been talking about, and Arthur's talked to us about the technology side of it. Let's talk a little bit about the creative side of it, and because the technology is ultimately going to evolve to suit creative needs as they arise. My experience of VR has first of all been, as Arthur said, that you can't watch it for very long, and that it is a strangely isolating experience. I've compared it to the last act of Our Town. Remember the scene where Emily Webb goes and revisits a moment from her past, but she can't interact with it, and it is terribly sad for her. It is like being a ghost. It is literally like being a ghost. When you go to a concert in VR or go to an event where there are people around you having fun, you can't interact with them. So how do you go and make VR more social?
Yeah, I think, well, the good news is there's great examples out there right now. For example, and again, to be very clear, we're not focused on the gaming community and creating content for the gaming community, but you can look for examples of how that technology works, where people log into a central server, they choose to join a room with their friends to play a game, and everything is synchronized at the start, and they're experiencing the same world, but choosing different places to enter and to interact. I think you could see how this will expand quickly for cinematic VR. For example, a concert. You have multiple cameras getting multiple vantage points, each vantage point representing a person's point of view in 360 degrees stereo. I could choose to start at the piano next to Paul McCartney, and a friend of mine could start at the front of the stage, and one might start at the nosebleeds. And we each are having experience, and we can talk about what we're seeing, and I could call down to my friend from the top. It's like, dude, you gotta get down here right away. I think that guy's gonna crowd surf, and there's no one there to catch him. So, you have this ability to share an experience, to bring people into your perspective, but you could also see that in a different form, almost like a gamification. I don't know how many people have kids, but you've probably read the I Spy books where you have to find objects in a room. And of course, you always think it's going to take 2 minutes, and an hour later, you're banging your head trying to find that fifth key. But imagine like you have a hunt, sort of a treasure hunt in a room full of activity and life, and you just can't find something. You call up your friend and say, hey, listen, you got to jump in here. I just can't find this last object. It's a competition. Perhaps it's being put on by Coca-Cola. And they jump in, they help you. So there is a communal aspect to it that can evolve. You can also record the content either in the first person or in the third person way, right? So we've done both, where the third person way, you basically fly on the wall and you do feel isolated, right? But that can actually be good, especially, for example, in a concert setting, because you're not really going to want to interact with the people around you. But in a narrative setting, they can involve you in the action and say, hey, let's go over here, and you look in that direction and something happens.
You were talking a little bit about stitching the images together. I mean, your process uses computational photography as well. Now, let me say this, as someone who's sort of a producer and a host, I had to get sort of a crash course in this. And one of the things that I learned is when I work with Jaunt, it's a little bit like the old days with film cameras where they shoot and they go off and they process the video and you get it maybe a day later. They said it was about a 10-to-1 rendering ratio when I started working.
About 20 to 1.
20 to 1. So,
yeah.
You know, what this means is you, as in the days of film, you can't get immediate playback. So we assume that Moore's law is going to play into all this, and all this is going to speed up. So much of this conference has been about more, better, and faster pixels. What's on your wish list? Do you want to see higher frame rates first? Do you want to see more resolution first? Do you want to see more dynamic range in the image first? What's most important to getting that sense of presence you're going for?
Well, this is clearly Arthur's domain, so I'll hand
Well,
that.
we clearly are going for quality first. I mean, you know, the processing time is not a huge issue when you're doing producing a piece for distribution, right? So what we're going for is the best types of sensors, the best types of synchronization, the best types of stitching algorithms, and the best sort of end user experience. And then over time, we will speed that up and make it go at frame rates and get to sort of a live experience. And there are some applications of that. But today, live is you know, there's a very small audience for it. I mean, if you're recording a game live, how many people are right now interested in watching that game that have an Oculus and have the bandwidth? Right? So that will happen eventually, but today that is not a goal for us.
Today's sensors are all designed for capturing a rectangular image of some aspect ratio or other. Would you look for another sensor design in the long run for VR capture?
So that's possible, but you know, it takes many years to develop a new sensor. So we're not like Lytro, where we're going to go down that rat hole. We're just going to use the existing sensor technology and hope somebody smart thinks of a better way of doing it.
My reaction to this has been, at first, was like, well, VR is about where TV was in 1938 or 39. That it could be about to take off. The TV would have taken off sooner if not for the Second World War. This could take off in a couple of years. On the other hand, I also think it's really more like cinema in about 1897, because it's a completely new medium, and a new grammar will have to be invented. You have been talking about you can't really move the camera, which is so much the essence of cinema. A lot of the directing techniques that I see coming for cinematic VR are going to come from stage and not from cinema or from television. What do you see as the creative direction that things are going to go in for narrative in cinematic VR?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I mean, this question comes up a lot in a couple different ways. You know, the first is, why is this different than the transition from 2D television to 3D, which had a lot of hype but never really lived up to it? The first thing, you know, I'm assuming a lot of people have already tried VR in one form or another, but it is a fundamentally different experience. It is like a punch in the gut of experience. 2D to 3D television, you know, a well-crafted show, you're already immersed in it, right? You lose the sense that you're in a room. And 3D adds a little bit more to it, but it's not so different that it takes you to a completely different place. VR is something entirely different. It takes over your senses, and if it's well crafted, not just mechanically, but also from a story perspective, which is vital, then it really can transport you, and it just has no comparison. To the point I've yet to find someone who can find the right words to describe what it's like for the first time to try VR. It's very hard to explain. But you know, more to your point, you know, there's things that people react to, light and sound. And light and sound are very critical to engaging your senses. And theater, which has been around for quite some time, he's utilized that successfully. And one of the key things that we're focused on at Jaunt is making sure that not only are the optics, the stereoscopic presentation of the world in true 360 degrees is as precise and as compelling as possible, but equally so that the audio can work on your senses to convey reality. Now, that's where Atmos has become so important to us, as well as our ambisonics. Sound should come from where they appear in the real world, and the combination of those two things give you the basis of a language to really express story, which ultimately is the key to this stuff.
Arthur, you showed an array of cameras. Some of them I've seen demonstrated. I've worked with the Jaunt camera. What is the difference between true VR capture and simple 360-degree video?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of differences. I mean, you know, a lot of the consumer cameras try to bring the sensors as close together as possible to create a single nodal point, which means that there's very little stitching that you need to do. And as a result, it's very cheap, and you can make a consumer version of it. But that will never give you parallax, right? And parallax is kind of your friend and your foe. Parallax creates depth, right? Because your eyes are separated now, and you can actually get a sense of depth. But that also introduces stitching effects. So, you know, as cameras become more elaborate, you know, you will see cameras that have parallax, but that solve that parallax, or that solve the stitching either by very smart computational photography algorithms or by having many lenses. Because the more lenses you have, the smaller the stitching artifacts are. So a true VR camera, in my opinion, is a high frame rate camera which records in high resolution and through 360 by 180 degrees, not a partial sphere, and that creates a 3D stereoscopic effect in a very compelling way. And then you can create a really good experience. There's more elaborate cameras that you can imagine, cameras that create volumetric video so that you can look around corners. Those are a few years away, but they're not impossible. My
first VR experiences were, first of all, that 30 years ago Dactyl Nightmare game.
Yeah.
And then this zombie game that I tried out a year ago here, and they were very physical. I found that combination of the immersive video and sound with the ability to move your body is incredibly compelling as entertainment. And to the point where that zombie game was almost too good. It's almost too scary. Can you take what you're doing now and bring motion into it, using a Kinect, using a harness, motion capture, whatever it is that you might use?
Well, I think this fundamentally falls in Arthur's court again, but I think this actually does bring up an important point that the things that you tried were computer generated, right? You were
both, yes.
Right. Polygons were being pushed to give you an experience. Now, pushing polygons requires a lot of horsepower. So immediately you're talking about a system that may be within the realm of gamers, but for the average person in the average household, you're not going to go out and spend $2,000 on a gaming system and have a tethered experience. Really what we're focused on is mobile first and foremost. You know, it is a fact that what is in your pocket, your phone, whether it is Android or iOS, is a portal to virtual reality. And I think the most important thing that people can take away from this session is that mobile will be the way that most people get VR in the next probably 12 months to 18 months as these other things develop. But the other key point of that is that there are systems out there right now, perhaps like Gear VR, which are fantastic. But it requires one of two phones from a particular vendor to get that quality of experience. There is more of a democratic view of this, that it shouldn't matter what phone you have, that if it was made in the last year and a half, it should play cinematic VR. No one should be excluded from experiencing this right now just because they have an upgrade to the latest and greatest phone, which is why what we're focused on is pushing not polygons, but frames of video, right? And that is important for several reasons. One, it works with an existing post-production workflow. Everyone in this room, I'm sure, is very familiar with the transitions from SD to HD, from 2D to 3D. Those represent various pain points in upgrading infrastructure. But what we're proposing is that a camera system, a proper VR camera system, may be strange looking, but it has a stop, start, record. You have a media ingest process, and then it just works with what you have. And those systems will change over time. But I think the more important part here is that, if we make VR really complicated and you have to strap on things, we're really limiting the audience, right? I've done lots of startups, and this is the first startup where my mom knows what I'm doing, right? I've recorded myself in Japan. We went to see the snow monkeys, and we took the camera with us, and it was me and my son, and we were recording ourselves. And then I showed it to my mom, and she took the cardboard, she put it on, and was looking around, and she looked at the snow monkeys, and she looks at my son, and she goes, "Oh my God, Emil's so tall." Right? And so immediately, I didn't give her any instructions. There was no controls. It was just like, look. Everybody knows how to look. And that's our audience, right? It's not you and me. Like, we're all about pixels and tracking and sensors, but she just enjoyed seeing my son. And that's the people that we're making content for.
We have just under 2 minutes left. I'll take a question from the audience. Does somebody want to run to a microphone? First up, someone's over there. Okay.
So about a year ago, they were talking about making experiments with carded video, similar to the way compositors composite in a 2D environment. And the subject went, well, that's a nice theory, but no one really ever said if that was going to be possible. And I was wondering if you guys had experimented with that in the solving the issue that you can't have polys. So essentially, you would only have your 6 faces because it'd just be a card.
But you can do carded video, but the problem is bandwidth, right? I mean, if you have, say, 5 layers, then you're going to send 5 high-resolution stereoscopic video streams to a consumer. So we think it's possible, but it is prohibitively expensive today. Our camera records what is known as a light field, so we can actually record depth as well as image. So we could actually create multiple video streams for different depth layers. But it turns out that, yes, you do get parallax when you look around, but it doesn't really add enough to the experience to warrant the fact that you suddenly need like a gigabit Ethernet connection to stream the video. Anyway, but it's a really good idea, and it's sort of the low-hanging fruit for creating parallax in video.
All right, we're going to take one more question. Before I do, has anybody actually seen the Jaunt demos and seen the Variety red carpet video? A few of you have.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can go download them on Android, and you can actually watch them on your phone, even if you don't have cardboard.
All right, let's take a question over here.
So, assuming that there are 26 letters in the alphabet, and you can only have that many series of venture capital funding, what is the monetization strategy?
Well, I'm very curious to hear this myself.
So today our business model is around production, about creating content. We're partnering with people to create content, and that's a good business model for the time being. But it's not very scalable. We're not going to grow 10x in the next year, right? I think in the long run, our business model is much more around distribution. If we can distribute content to millions of people, like a boxing match that would cost you $50 on HBO, that we can sell you for maybe less or maybe more because it's actually a better experience. Well, that's a business model. So I think that's the business model that we're going for, and I think that is a proven and very scalable business model.
Yeah, I would just add to that it's you can see it exists today in some form or another in, for example, iTunes. Say that you have a serialized story, which I think actually serialization is going to be a fantastic opportunity for narrative. And each version of the story, each installment of the stories is 2 minutes long. The first might be free. You can buy the next 2, 3, 4, 5 out of a 5-part series, or you could complete your album at any time. So I think getting the pieces of content and finding the monetization path is actually very attractive right now, because in the beginning there is not a ton of content. Right this second, as you point out, there's a lot of funding out there.
But today all the content is going to be promotional anyway, because we're trying to create the medium, right? There's nobody who's going to pay money. Well, there's some people who would pay money for a VR experience, but that's a very small group. We're all for creating a new industry. So we're going to try to give away as much great content as we can afford until there is an audience.
Right.
And then we'll figure out what the business model is.
All right. Thank you both for being here. Arthur Van Hoff, Scott Brook from Jaunt VR. Thank you for listening, everybody.